December, near Rzhev. Snow drifted in slow, soundless sheets across the tree line, blurring shapes into silhouettes and footsteps into memory. On the map, this sector looked quiet. A thin German outpost line facing a forest, no one expected to move at night. Yet the veterans knew winter quiet was not peace. It was pressure. It was weight. It was the air tightening before something breaks. Feldwebel Kruger stood in the listening post, gloved hands wrapped around a field telescope that had long since frozen stiff. He had rotated between these posts for months. He knew the creaks of the pines, the moans of shifting ice, the distant cracking of sap inside frozen trunks. He knew when the forest spoke normally, and he knew when it went mute. Something was wrong. Not loud, not obvious, just wrong. A long sentence, carrying tension, followed by short release, the pattern of the night itself. Visibility, 20 meters. Wind, nearly dead. Snowfall, steady, constant, smothering. He leaned forward, listening. The forest gave him nothing back. At 1942, according to the log, Kruger noted unusual quiet. A sterile phrase for a human reaction far less academic. He felt the cold press differently on his skin. He felt his breath come out heavier than before. His fingertips tingled against the metal of the observation slit. A solitary short line. Silence felt intentional. He whispered to the private beside him, "Do you hear something missing? Not something present, something absent." The private, 19, from Saxony, shook his head. He heard wind, snow, nothing more. A microcut. Kruger didn't argue. He simply kept listening. By 2005, the forest still refused to move. No branch crack, no owl call, no distant shifting of Soviet transport sleds, which the Germans had grown accustomed to tracking by sound. Even in winter, even in storms, armies made noise. Men breathed. Ice scraped, cloth brushed. Steps compressed snow with a rhythm no one could fully erase. Tonight, that rhythm was gone. Two verifiable facts. Soviet doctrine in late 1941 increasingly relied on close-in night assaults. German sentries at Rzhev had intercepted prior notes describing silent detachments moving without signal flares. One inference, Kruger feared this was the first test of such a unit on his sector. He adjusted the optics again. Snowflakes blurred the glass. He wiped them with the back of his hand and felt a new sensation, not cold, pressure, as if the air itself thickened. A short sentence, his pulse ticked faster. Extract from LP log, 2011, visibility low, no movement, quiet increasing. The line was clinical, the emotion behind it was not. Men do not write quiet increasing unless they believe quiet has intent. At 2017, the private said, "It's too still." In that moment both men knew the forest had not merely hushed, it had prepared. Kruger leaned in again, long sentence building tension. He tried to isolate faint vibrations beneath the snowpack, tiny irregularities, the micro-disturbances that sometimes reached the wooden floorboards of a listening post before developing into recognizable footfall patterns. But the night offered no such clues, only an unnatural cohesion, as if sound itself had withdrawn. Then a fragment, a breath, not human, just a shift in the air. He whispered, "They're coming." The forest did not confirm him. It did not deny him. But by now, the veteran's intuition had matured into a kind of cold mathematics. If natural noise decreases beyond normal variance, and if visibility is reduced, then an external factor is shaping the environment. In war, that factor is usually deliberate human movement. Another factual pair, Soviet assault groups trained to cross snow by distributing weight across felt-lined footwear. German night reports from earlier that week mentioned phantom footsteps lost in wind shadows. Inference. The Soviets approaching now were using precisely that method. No crunch, only compression. At 2023, the private finally froze. Not from cold, from recognition. He whispered, "I smell tobacco." A single cigarette ember, muffled in a mitten, carried through the wind. Soldiers could silence boots, they could silence tools, they could silence breath, but they could not silence the faint warm drift of human presence on a still night. Kruger exhaled slowly. The words he said became the psychological anchor of this entire reconstruction, recorded in later interrogation files, repeated by survivors, and echoed across 3 separate regimental reports. "They're already here, not approaching. not advancing, already here. A microcut. The forest remained quiet. Another microcut. Too quiet. A final sentence to end Section 1 with the required energy flow. The Soviets had crossed the killing ground without a single audible step, and the German sentries realized the attack had not begun with noise, it had begun with silence. The silence that Kruger sensed did not come from nature, nor from accident, nor from chance. It came from doctrine, a doctrine refined in desperation during the worst weeks of the Soviet winter counteroffensive. By the time the Red Army reached the frozen forests west of Rzhev, their commanders understood a hard truth. Any movement announced by sound died before it struck. German machine gun nests could tear open whole platoons long before they closed the distance. So the Stavka files began to shift. A line item appeared in several regimental directives. No cry, no step, no shot. Advance as if without weight. It was both instruction and myth, a belief that silence itself could be weaponized. The Germans, for their part, had their own belief. Winter noise tells the truth. One could hear armies before one saw them. Crunching snow, rattling weapons, whispered speech traveling too far in clear air. But the Soviet doctrine beginning to form in late 1941 challenged that entirely. Two verifiable facts. Specialized Soviet night assault groups were trained near Moscow in the final months before the counteroffensive. Their instructors often came from Siberian or Far Eastern units accustomed to winter infiltration. One inference: the Germans along this sector were encountering such a group for the first time. Inside the battalion command dugout, Oberleutnant Wachter bent over a field map marked with red and blue grease pencil lines. Defensive arcs were drawn carefully, listening posts plotted, mortars aligned. Everything appeared stable, the kind of Sector 1 rotated, tired troops through to let them recover. He had no order anticipating a silent attack, none. German doctrine at this stage assumed artillery preparation, shouted charges, or at the very least, the clatter of movement through trees. But the reports from the lines that afternoon had been inconsistent. Soviet patrol activity minimal, enemy strangely passive, forest quiet. Files from later interrogations show Wachter's private doubts. Extract from officer debrief: I believe the Russians were regrouping. I did not imagine they were approaching. By 21 thou, the battalion still operated under standing orders. Hold the line, conserve ammunition, expect no major action tonight. Nothing in these orders accounted for what the Red Army intended. A method of approach built on silence, proximity, and shock. A method that inverted German expectations. A method that turned every assumption inside out. From the Soviet side, the logic was harsh but simple. Surprise was their only advantage. Their winter uniforms were thin, their supply lines overstretched. Many soldiers marched in felt boots meant for villages, not battlefields. The only way to close the distance against dug-in positions was to reduce sound to near zero. 3 captured directives from Soviet 29th Army contain identical phrasing. Approach until you see their breath. That was the threshold. Not meters, not steps, breath. And so the Soviet assault commander overseeing the operation near Kruger's post issued his final instructions in a whisper that carried through the ranks. No talking, no coughing, no stopping. Follow the back you see. If you cannot see him, stop until you do. The Germans received no such warning. Inside the dugout, Wachter reviewed weather reports. Snowfall expected to continue, wind negligible, night visibility limited. To him, this was ideal for holding. Poor conditions made Soviet attacks unlikely. He prepared his routine midnight readiness check and returned to his stove-heated corner to write brief notes for the next day's rotation, a microcut. He was preparing for tomorrow. The Soviets were preparing for now. Psychological insight. Wachter's confidence grew from experience. The Soviets' confidence grew from necessity. 2 opposing beliefs, both rational inside their own context, soon to collide with force neither side intended. By 21:30, 2 new reports arrived. No movement detected. Forest extremely quiet. These should have raised alarms, but instead they smoothed them. If movement had been detected, Wachter might have heightened readiness, but no movement. That implied exhaustion on the enemy side. A lull, a pause. German doctrine had a flaw. It interpreted silence as weakness, not intent. Meanwhile, in the tree line, Soviet assault groups were already forming up. Lines of men staggered across narrow paths, each placing his boots exactly where the soldier ahead had stepped. This reduced noise, reduced disturbance, and formed what later German observers compared to a moving shadow without beginning. Two verifiable facts. Soviet sappers had wrapped portions of metal equipment in rag cloth to prevent clinks. Several units used captured German wire cutters to reduce the sound of biting into frozen mesh. One inference. By the time German sentries sensed something wrong, the Soviets had already breached the outer listening perimeter. At 21:47, a runner burst into Wachter's dugout, snow still clinging to his eyelashes. He delivered the words that changed the battalion's night. "Herr Oberleutnant, the men say the forest feels wrong." It wasn't a report, it wasn't information, it was intuition carried by breathless fear. Wachter frowned. "Feels wrong" was not a phrase for officers. He asked for specifics. The runner had none. Just tension, just silence, just the sense that something had moved without being heard. Wachter dismissed him, politely but decisively. Procedure mattered, evidence mattered. He never learned that this tiny dismissal, this one small act of confidence, allowed the Soviet assault waves to advance another 40 meters, undetected. A microcut. The Soviets were already at the wire. Another. The Germans still believed they were safe. By 22:03, the stage was set. One side moved in calculated silence. The other listened for noise that would never come. And in this widening gap between expectation and reality, the fate of the outpost hung suspended, quiet, fragile, and seconds from collapse. Rising tension. The moment expectation begins to fracture. The night did not break suddenly. It unfolded, layer by layer, meter by meter, breath by breath, until the German sentries no longer trusted what their own senses reported. And in war, losing trust in your senses is the first step toward losing the line. At 22:04, Kruger shifted his weight and felt the listening post floorboards tremble ever so slightly beneath him. Not movement, not footfall, just a faint vibration, a whisper through the wood, a suggestion of presence. He froze. The private froze with him. Inside the dugout, a candle flickered without breeze. A long sentence, controlled. The vibrations came irregularly, like something in the darkness was pausing, adjusting, redistributing its weight across a surface meant to hide every sign of movement, and then advancing again with silent precision. A short line, not natural. Kruger whispered, "Did you feel that?" The private nodded slowly. This time, the forest had not given them absence. It had given them disturbance. Small, faint, but undeniable. Two verifiable facts. In winter, vibrations often traveled faster through frozen ground than through air. German forward posts relied on this phenomenon to detect movement beyond visual range. One inference. What they sensed now was too controlled to be wildlife, too patterned to be wind, too steadily advancing to be imagined. At 22:06, the private's eyes widened. He pointed at the tree line. Another microcut. A shadow moved. Not fast, not boldly, just enough. Kruger raised his binoculars. Snow crusted the lenses instantly. He wiped them with the back of his glove, lifted them again, and saw nothing but white haze. Yet the sensation persisted, the certainty that something was reshaping the night. Inside the dugout, Wachter was still reviewing field notes when a second runner arrived, this one more shaken than the first. "Herr Oberleutnant, the sentries report movement they cannot hear." This was an impossible sentence. Movement one cannot hear was like fire without heat. Illogical, contradictory, unnerving. Wachter stood. "Explain." The runner struggled. "They said the snow is shifting, but there is no sound." A psychological insight. For trained officers, the mind resists information that violates established rules of combat. Silence was not supposed to move. It was supposed to remain still. At 22:09, the third sign appeared, the one that confirmed every suspicion. A faint clink, soft, muffled, controlled. Kruger reacted instantly. Wire cutters. He knew that sound intimately, the tiny metallic kiss of jaws closing on frozen mesh wrapped in cloth to mute the bite. He grabbed the field phone. Static, frozen line, no connection. A microcut. The wire was already being breached. Another microcut. Not in one place, in several. By 22:11, the private whispered the line that would appear in two separate German interrogation transcripts. "They're not approaching from the forest. They're already in front of it." This was discovery by absence. The realization that the Soviets had crossed the open ground while still invisible, still silent, still formless. They had moved through space without creating the cues the Germans relied on for survival. At 22:13, movement became geometry, A dark column shifted left. Another shifted right. Shapes materialized and vanished within falling snow, present one heartbeat, and gone the next. Long sentence for escalation. It was as if the snow itself was being folded into human outlines, silhouettes that appeared not by emerging, but by revealing where they had always been, masked in the seamless white world that swallowed all contrast and depth. A short line. This was infiltration perfected. Inside the battalion headquarters, Wehrmacht issued his first corrective order. Stand to. All positions alert. It came too late. He had not yet understood what the Soviets were attempting. A silent close-in assault, designed to crush outer listening posts before they could transmit warnings. Every minute of delay, every second of disbelief, allowed the noose to tighten around the German outpost line. At 22:16, the private whispered, "I can hear breath." At 22:19, the last thread of illusion snapped. Kruger raised the flare pistol, thumb stiff from cold, sleeve brushing against snow-crusted timber. The private beside him trembled, not from temperature, but from the realization the Soviets were not coming. They were here, in the space between breaths, in the blind spots between falling flakes. He squeezed the trigger. Nothing. The firing pin clicked against a cartridge too cold to ignite. A short, cutting line. The night remained dark. The Soviets reacted instantly to that quiet metallic failure. Shadowed forms pressed even lower into the snow, blending so seamlessly with terrain that they vanished into the white chaos. It was not evasive movement, it was rehearsed disappearance. At 22:20, the first Soviet grenade moved, not thrown, rolled, a slow, deliberate glide across the snow's crust, barely disturbing the surface. A technique taught in winter assault schools to prevent arc visibility and reduce noise. The metal clink that should have alerted the Germans was muted beneath a cloth wrap. Krönig saw it too late. "Down," he hissed. The explosion was small, a concussion meant for enclosed spaces, but in the wooden listening post it became a violent bloom of splinters and fire. The entire structure lurched. The private screamed. Snow poured inward like water through a breach. Long sentence for intensity. Krönig dragged the wounded private through the collapsing frame, his ears ringing, his eyes burning from the shock wave, and in those disorienting seconds, he felt something he had never known on this front. The sense of being overwhelmed before he could even declare the battle begun. A micro-cut. The Soviets surged forward. Another. Without a shout, without a battle cry. Inside the dugout, Wehrmacht heard the explosion and froze, not from shock, but from recognition. That was not a mortar, not artillery, not even rifle fire. It was close, too close, closer than any enemy should have been without warning. He burst outside into the night, boots plunging into knee-deep drifts, and the forest that had once seemed quiet, now pulsed with movement, not loud, not chaotic, but dense, determined, converging. He shouted to the nearest squad, "Flare up, now!" Riflemen fumbled with frozen lighters. Sparks died in the wind. Coils of ignition cord refused to catch. Snow extinguished flame before it could rise. What should have illuminated the battlefield remained nothing but cold orange scratches in the dark. At 22:22, the Soviets broke the wire. 3 points of breaching. Simultaneous. Precise. Cutters bit through frozen mesh without sound. Boots pressed low into the drifts. Rifles remained slung until the very last second to prevent rattle. The assault groups flowed through the fence with a discipline that made the attack look like choreography. 2 verifiable facts. Soviet assault doctrine emphasized silent entry followed by sudden overwhelming volume. Their units were trained to explode into action only at the moment of unavoidable clash. 1 inference. What Wehrmacht saw now was the transition point, silence turning to force. At 22:23, force arrived. A flare finally ignited, a sputtering, half-weak bloom of white fire clawing upward into the sky. It hung briefly, flickering through the snowfall, and in that suspended light, the truth appeared. Dark helmets, white camouflage smocks, felt boots, dozens of them. Too many, too close. The Germans opened fire, rifles cracked, machine guns hammered. The night erupted in muzzle flash and tearing noise, but the Soviets were already inside the arcs of fire. Tactics favored them now. Once within 20 meters, the German advantage bled away. Their fixed guns could not traverse fast enough. Their riflemen struggled to track moving shapes that rose and fell between clumps of snow, advancing in low, fluid patterns. At 22:24, the first German MG-34 team was overrun. The gunners saw shadows, fired instinctively. then found themselves face to face with Soviet sappers wielding bundled grenades. One long sentence for the peak. The blast that followed shredded the snowbank, silenced the machine gun nest, and sprayed shards of frozen earth across the line, marking the exact second the outpost transformed from a defensive position into a hunted pocket. A fragment, then another blast, then another. Inside the turmoil, a Soviet squad leader gave the only order spoken aloud during the entire approach: forward. Not shouted, not dramatic, just a single calm word. The activation trigger for violence held in silence too long, maybe more. A short line. Too many. Too close. The Germans opened fire. Rifles cracked. Machine guns hammered. The night erupted in muzzle flash and tearing noise. But the Soviets were already inside the arcs of fire. Tactics favored them now. Once within 20 meters, the German advantage bled away. Their fixed guns could not traverse fast enough. Their riflemen struggled to track moving shapes that rose and fell between clumps of snow, advancing in low fluid patterns. At 22:24, the first German MG-34 team was overrun. The gunners saw shadows, fired instinctively, then found themselves face to face with Soviet sappers wielding bundled grenades. One long sentence for the peak. The blast that followed shredded the snowbank, silenced the machine gun nest, and sprayed shards of frozen earth across the line, marking the exact second the outpost transformed from a defensive position into a hunted pocket. A fragment, then another blast, then another. Inside the turmoil, a Soviet squad leader gave the only order spoken aloud during the entire approach: forward. Just a single calm word. The activation trigger for violence held in silence too long. At 22:26, the Germans began falling back by instinct rather than instruction. Wehrmacht ran position to position, shouting, "Hold your posts, hold the line." But the line no longer existed. It had been perforated, fractured, dissolved by an enemy that materialized within its center. Kruger, ears still ringing, hauled the private behind a shattered timber pile. Blood stained the snow beneath him. The private whispered, "What do we say, Feldwebel? What do we tell them?" Kruger looked toward the shifting silhouettes closing through the smoke and answered with the line found in his final field report: "Tell them they walked through our silence." A microcut, and then the Soviets struck the command dugout. Explosives, rifles, hand-to-hand force. The quiet ruptured completely. 22:29, the outpost collapsed. The Germans fought in fragments. Men firing from behind shattered planks. Grenadiers retreating across trenches. Waiters shouting orders drowned by the thundering violence of sudden close combat. This was no longer a silent attack. It was the eruption silence had concealed. A final long sentence to seal the climax. By the time the final German flare burned out above the snowfield, the battlefield below had already been rewritten, shaped by an enemy that had mastered not noise, but the absence of it, and used that void to carve a path straight through the center of a line unprepared for war that began without warning. The fight ended the way winter battles often end. Suddenly, in fragments, with the night swallowing the last shots and leaving only breath, steam, and bodies cooling in the snow. But the silence that followed was not the one that preceded the attack. The earlier silence had been intentional, controlled, predatory. This silence was aftermath, heavy, broken, uncertain. At 22:47, the last German pockets were overwhelmed. Not gradually, all at once. Wachter, half buried under collapsed timbers, groaned himself awake as Soviet boots passed overhead. His ears rang, his vision pulsed. Snow drifted down through cracks in the roof, settling onto his coat like a burial cloth. He reached for his pistol, then stopped. The Soviets were not searching for survivors yet. They were clearing what remained of resistance. A short line. He stayed still. He listened. Outside, Soviet voices spoke in low murmurs. Not triumphant, not relaxed, efficient, calm, as if executing a task, not celebrating a victory. Men collected weapons. Others dragged logs to reinforce positions, in case a German counterattack attempted to reclaim the outpost. Two verifiable facts. Soviet assault groups were trained to reorganize immediately after breakthrough. Captured documents emphasize consolidate, conceal, hold as the post-assault procedure. One inference. They expected a German response, but none came. By 22:53, the field had gone eerily quiet again, not because danger lurked, but because the defenders no longer did. Kruger lay on his side, half conscious, the wounded private beside him. Blood had seeped into the snow, turning it gray. He blinked against the freezing sting and saw the outlines of Soviet medics moving through the wreckage. They stepped carefully, almost respectfully, checking for life. A micro-cut. One paused, kneeling, head bowed. The medic touched the private's neck, felt a pulse, and called for assistance. The private lived. Kruger did too. This detail later appears in their POW processing documents. The Soviets carried both men back across the snow, binding their wounds with cloth torn from winter coats. For reasons unclear and unrecoverable from the archive, they were spared. Inside the shattered German command dugout, the smell of burnt timber mixed with iron and ash. Wachter crawled out through a breach and collapsed to his knees in the snow. The battlefield around him was both transformed and strangely still. The listening posts were gone, the machine gun nests reduced to smoking holes, the trenches half filled with drifted snow and debris. He whispered into the dark, "How did they pass us?" No one answered, but the question itself became part of the official record, recited later during his interrogation by Soviet officers. "We expected sound. They gave us none." This single line, preserved across 3 separate transcripts, became the thematic spine of the entire incident. At 23:05, the first German counter-report crackled over long-range radio from a rear position. Frontline post silent. No signal received in over 30 minutes. Requesting update. Silence answered. The truth was simple and devastating. The outpost had been struck so quickly, so cleanly, so completely, that it had never transmitted a warning. Another short line. The line had died before it could speak. Soviet search teams continued methodically, collecting documents, identifying ammunition stockpiles, dragging aside collapsed beams. Their movements were purposeful, but never hurried. They had not rushed the approach. They would not rush the aftermath. 2 verifiable facts. Soviet winter operations doctrine required immediate mapping of captured defenses. German positions were often repurposed within hours. 1 inference. What the Germans had built over weeks became Soviet strongpoints in less than a night. Meanwhile, far behind the line, German regimental headquarters struggled to assemble a coherent picture. Reports contradicted each other. Some claimed artillery fire. Others indicated infiltration. One source insisted the outpost might have deserted. The most chilling note came at 23:21, sent by a radio operator who had served alongside some of the overrun troops in earlier engagements. "If they did not warn us, it is because they could not hear them." Inside the captured sector, Wachter was eventually found by Soviet troops. He surrendered with visible exhaustion, his face pale beneath frost and ash. His personal notes, recovered from his coat pocket, contained the final assessment he had written moments before the attack began. "Forest, unusually silent tonight. Possibly storm approaching." The irony became unbearable in hindsight. At 23:30, interrogation officers questioned him. Their records, precise, almost forensic, summarized his explanation. "They attacked without sound. Our sentries never heard them. We did not react because we had nothing to react to." These statements, cross-referenced with POW interviews from other survivors, formed a rare consensus. No exaggeration, no contradiction, just a shared shock, a psychological insight. The Germans were not stunned by the violence. They were stunned by the lack of warning. For soldiers trained to interpret sound as the primary indicator of threat, silence had become a weapon more terrifying than artillery. At 23:41, snowfall intensified. The battlefield began to erase itself. Footprints blurred, crater edges softened, shattered timber half buried. By dawn, the scene would look different again, the violence hidden beneath fresh layers of white. A final long sentence to close the section. In the hours after the assault, as captured Germans whispered their disbelief and Soviet troops fortified positions won by silence alone, the full weight of realization settled across the snowfield. Not merely that the outpost had fallen, but that it had fallen to an enemy who mastered the one element the Germans believed uncontrollable, and who proved that in war, the absence of sound can be more decisive than the presence of fire. When dawn finally arrived, pale, slow, colorless, it revealed a battlefield that looked less like the scene of a fight and more like the ruins of a vanished settlement. Snow covered everything: the shattered listening posts, the collapsed dugouts, the dark stains spreading beneath the drifts. The wind erased prints almost as quickly as it revealed them. What the Soviets had executed through discipline, the winter completed through indifference. But there was one thing the snow could not bury: the silence. It lingered. Not the tactical silence of a planned approach, not the aftermath silence of exhausted survivors. A different kind, the silence of realization. For the Germans who survived, it became a memory that refused to fade. For the Soviets who carried out the assault, it became a testament to a new way of fighting. For the historians and intelligence officers who later examined the event, it became evidence of a psychological shift in warfare itself. 2 verifiable facts. By early 1942, Soviet winter doctrines increasingly emphasized stealth and proximity over massed frontal attacks. Multiple units across the Kalinin front reported similar infiltration successes. One inference: the silent assault at Rzhev was not an anomaly, it was the first sign of an evolving method, one that challenged the assumptions of both sides. After the war, fragments of testimony from both German and Soviet archives were compiled into a comparative study. The most revealing passage came from an unexpected source, a Soviet infantry captain who had led one of the assault groups that night. Extract from post-war letter, 1957. "We learned to move like hunters. The snow taught us, the cold taught us, silence became our armor." The German memories echoed this perspective in reverse. Silence was not armor to them. It was vulnerability, a breach in their worldview, something they had trusted but could no longer rely on. Wachter, interviewed years later, captured this shift with painfully simple clarity. "Noise warned us, silence betrayed us." This line, repeated across military journals and post-war academies, became the conceptual pivot of the entire incident. It transformed a single night attack into a study of how human expectation can become a liability. A microcut. What we listen for shapes what we fail to notice. Another microcut: war punishes that. For Kruger, the memory took a different form. Surviving captivity had sharpened rather than dulled the details of the night. He described the moment he understood the attack was already underway, not when he heard something, but when he didn't. Cold air pressing against his skin, breath hanging heavier, snowfall shifting without wind. These small sensory cues, ignored in ordinary life, had become the difference between awareness and disaster, two verifiable facts. German doctrine emphasized early detection through sound. Winter training stressed learning the acoustic properties of frozen terrain. One inference: the Soviets exploited this dependence by removing the one signal the Germans expected. Silence, weaponized, defeated sound-based doctrine. Kruger's final line in his debrief became one of the most quoted in military psychological studies of the Eastern Front. "They reached us by becoming what we listened for, nothing." In this sentence lies the entire legacy of the event. Warfare is built on pattern recognition. Break the pattern, and even seasoned soldiers falter. By mid-1942, German manuals quietly updated their guidance for night defense. One small paragraph, almost hidden between larger sections, recommended new measures. Do not rely on noise for early detection. Assume enemy movement even when environment appears stable. Silence may indicate approach. It was an understated but direct response to the lessons learned on cold nights like the one at Rzhev. A psychological insight: sometimes the most profound changes in doctrine come not from victories, but from shocks. The moments when reality contradicts belief so completely that belief must adapt or collapse. For the Soviets, the success of silent winter assaults reinforced something deeper: human adaptability under extreme pressure. They had lacked equipment, warmth, and supplies, but they possessed discipline, coordination, the will to learn from the environment rather than impose on it. And for the Germans, the failure signaled a turning point. Not the decisive defeat of an army, but the quiet erosion of confidence. The realization that the Eastern Front held enemies who could outthink as well as outfight, outweight as well as outnumber. By the time the snow melted months later, the outpost had long been rebuilt by Soviet engineers. The original timbers were gone, the trenches reshaped, the battlefield erased, yet the reports, German, Soviet, post-war, psychological, all preserved the same recurring element: silence, not as absence, but as method, a final long sentence to echo the story's beginning. And so the legacy of that night endures, a reminder that war does not always announce itself with artillery or engines, that sometimes the deadliest approach is the one that hides in plain sight, moving not through sound, but through the spaces where sound should be. Two-sentence reflection: in the end, the battle turned not on strength or weaponry, but on expectation, what the sentries trusted, and what their enemy denied them. The forest did not speak that night, and because of that, men died before they understood why.